All right, this is number 6 in Mrs. Green's Civil Rights series. This is last but certainly not least. In fact, I would argue this is one of the more interesting and more important ones. It's only 8 slides, but it's a lot of information, so be prepared. This one's going to discuss the difference between Martin Luther King and his civil rights movement and the more militant aspects of the Black Panther movement and some of that. So there's going to be a lot of kind of information to cover here. Understand that you could look at the various protest groups as coming after this, because the Black Power movement is definitely kind of a part of one of these groups that says, wait a minute, I don't think we're getting equality and fairness quickly enough. Okay. And I've touched on this before when I mentioned some of the riots of 1966, that you have a great deal of racism that still exists. That even though legally the voting issues have been solved, even though legally desegregation has been ended, the difference between doing it by the law and doing it in fact are two very different things. And so you have cities that are left with a large Black population because of the flight to the suburbs. This is what we call white flight. And you have, because of the segregation, because of the discrimination, a limited number of really professionals working. In fact, for Black families, they'd been two-income families for a long time. So this idea in the 60s that the mom stayed home to raise the kids was not what happened for many Black women. And so they're continuing to deal with a great deal of poverty and having a lot of frustration, even once they get things like the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and that kind of thing. So 65, 66, you have a lot of race riots happening. Watts, LA in California, Detroit, Chicago. If you pull up this, you can watch the Watts newsreel. Great deal of damage. I mean, these are people destroying their own property. Think in terms of like the Ferguson riots and how people were critical of Ferguson and I can't believe that they're tearing up their own neighborhoods and that kind of thing. But there's just a lot of anger and frustration, and it becomes this mob activity that doesn't make sense, because once mobs get going, you can't always reason with them and control them. And so a lot of white America by 66, here they've been all this very progressive and very, we need to change things, we need to make it different. Yes, the war on poverty. Yes, equal rights. And then you get to 66 and they're watching, these cities burning up because Blacks are angry that they don't have enough economic opportunity. And really this kind of creates this momentum of many middle-class whites to kind of go, what else can I do? Like the frustration of, we can't seem to fix this. And the country's everybody's always mad. And, I want to go back to the good old days and all this kind of stuff. And so you have this huge frustration, not only by Blacks, but by whites as well. And people of other races, what's going on? I want my rights. I don't have the economic opportunity. So really the late 60s, the frustration with Vietnam, as well as all this other frustration, really makes it a tense period. 1967, we have LBJ orders a study on these riots, and what you see is that that this study really talks about the role of racism and how it creates these two societies, and recommends even more jobs, more housing, except by the time you get to 1967, Vietnam's going really, really badly, and the country's really, really frustrated with LBJ. And, and here's the thing, that the budget, we've run out of money, right? Money is tight because we're spending all this money on the war on poverty, we're spending all this money on Vietnam. There's not the money left in the federal budget to make the changes that the Kerner Commission recommends. And so this is going to be a huge issue in 1967. In fact, Martin Luther King will certainly advocate. He goes, now once he's achieved the Voting Rights Act, he turns his attention to trying to resolve the economic disparities. And he leads a number of different marches trying to resolve, trying to draw attention to the poverty that Blacks were facing. It's in 1967 that Martin Luther King starts to really come out against Vietnam. and really start to say, why are we doing this? Don't we have enough problems at home? And he starts to be a little bit critical. So we tend to forget, we focus on Martin Luther King from 65 and before, but there's the Martin Luther King of 66, 67, and 68, who is a little more radical, a little more harsh in the way he talks about conditions. And that kind of gets pushed aside. People aren't sure what to make of that because there's this larger context of this economic frustration in Vietnam and all these different groups clamoring for rights that create this tension. And so it makes Martin Luther King's legacy a little more confusing. So just kind of keep that in mind. So you go into 67 and you've got a number of groups that are really starting to ask hard questions about economic equality. And they feel like Martin Luther King has not been enough of an advocate for really systematically changing the system. Yes, he's advocated for these changes in laws, but they want more. It's not enough, right? And, we can debate whether or not that was the right way to be. But I'm just telling you that's how it was. They questioned, what have we been doing all this for? Why do we need white people to give us stuff? So you see that CORE and SNCC expel their white members, and you really almost have kind of a reverse, I don't want to say reverse discrimination, but a reaction in the black community. We don't need whites to give us stuff. We need to break down the system. Right? And their accusation against Martin Luther King is that he keeps going to white people and asking them to do things and make changes when what black communities need to do is tear down the system. And this is where you start to have this idea of black power. Black power, and it gets mislabeled as kind of a communist thing. And I'm not suggesting it didn't have some communist elements, because it does. But it definitely is meant to impact poor black neighborhoods. And one of the best things that we miss about the Black Panther movement is they focused on breakfast programs, lunch programs for kids. They focused on after-school programs. They focused on, education. A lot of what they talked about was not all bad, but people would get very intimidated because they would wear black leather jackets and black berets and have guns on their back, and people would say, oh my gosh, what are they trying to do? Well, their issue was that the police tended to target black communities, and there was police violence, and they were mad about that. And guys, this is very relevant to today. I mean, this is one of the things about Black Lives Matter, that there's police violence targeted against blacks. And the Black Power movement says this isn't right, and we should be able to defend ourselves. We shouldn't have to let police beat on us like that. And so I definitely think that that's a big part of it, right? This idea of self-defense, this not being afraid to fight back if you have to, which is, Martin Luther King's attitude was don't fight back. You don't respond. You sit there. You're passive. And by, you not responding to their injustice, you show just how unjust they are. Well, the Black Power movement said, no, we should be able to push back. We should be able to fight and protect ourselves. And again, notice that they focus a lot on racial distinctiveness. This is where the big afros come in, the dashikis, the idea of real black culture, black exploitation movies, all this kind of stuff. You begin to see African American history classes and, real focus on African American culture. So it's not only a political movement and a political, an economic movement, it's also a cultural movement that we're going to be proud of being black, and we're going to be proud of who we are, and we're no longer going to be ashamed and apologize for our skin color. And it's also into this, another element is going to be Malcolm X. He's also somewhat affiliated with Black Power, although not exactly with the Black Panthers. He's going to be known as kind of the Nation of Islam. He's the leader of the Nation of Islam, very powerful speaker, very critical of white society, very critical of Martin Luther King and his, oh, whites, can you please give us rights, and can you please give us economic opportunity? He argued that, that white society was corrupt and that they were never going to treat people well. He argues for self-sufficiency, that black communities need to take care of black communities. He even goes so far as to at times suggest separation from white society. He doesn't talk about violence to the degree that the Black Panthers are willing to. He certainly disavows kind of kind of riots and stuff, but he does say you can defend yourself. And he's very much, so he's Black Power, but he's also Nation of Islam. And his variation of Black Power is a little bit different than some of the others. And he uses the name X because he rejects his last name because that was his slave name. And he'll ultimately be killed in February of 1965 by the Nation of Islam. There's actually an internal power struggle. So it's very unfortunate because you know, he had really started to, after he travels to Mecca, he comes back and he interestingly begins to kind of meet in the middle. He was more radical when he was younger. And, you know, Martin Luther King is you know, very passive resistance. And they start to actually kind of drift together on this political spectrum. And because he rejects this kind of control by the Nation of Islam, he ends up getting assassinated in February of 65. But he is very influential because he does encourage blacks to take pride in their culture and to stand up for themselves. And he has the conversation that, you know, why are we asking white society for what they should have given us all along? And, you know, there's truth to that, right? That's what the 14th and 15th Amendment were supposed to do. Why did they have to go back, you know, 50, 60, 70 years later and fix those things? Those things should have been fixed once, and they weren't. And so he's calling attention to that, and that's a really good conversation to have. And so Malcolm X is another name. Black Panthers, they talk about self-defense, the economic, you know, the black nationalism. They talk a lot about a 10-point program, black empowerment, controlling of major institutions within black communities. In other words, blacks run black agencies and that kind of thing, that you have black police officers, that kind of thing. And they have this whole 10-point program. It's about ending poverty. And really, the Black Panthers are not just about standing up for blacks. They're about standing up for the poor. They're about standing up for the exploited, right? So really, they go out to other groups, not just to blacks, to kind of reach out to them in order to try to get them on board with what they're trying to do. Now, yes, they do talk about Black Power, Black Pride, that kind of thing. But, you know, there's more to them than just that. So be sure you kind of keep that in mind. But the late 1960s, you have these competing visions with, you know, the Nation of Islam offering this one view of kind of this almost kind of segregated black community, and, you know, with a lot of emphasis on tight family units. You're going to see that the Black Panthers emerge with their economic program appealing to all oppressed, but particularly blacks, kind of a general Black Power movement and Black Pride. And then you're going to see, you know, Martin Luther King's agencies. You're going to have SNCC expelling its white members. So you've got all these different groups. And so even within the civil rights movement, they start to fracture, just like all these other groups begin to fracture and demand rights. And so what will happen is that, you know, white society will look at the Black Power movement and the Black Panther movement, and they'll feel it as a threat as opposed to, you know, they're proud of being black, they're proud of their own culture, and they'll perceive that as being kind of a slight against white society. And you know, sometimes people talk that way even now when they talk about Black Lives Matter. Well, don't white lives matter? They're not saying that white lives don't matter. They're talking about the fact that you have this police violence against blacks, and how do we figure out what's causing that? How do we address that problem? And so you have some of the same reaction then. So the Black Power movement tends to, I mean, it's powerful in black communities. I don't know that it's powerful as far as the national platform, as far as the United States is concerned, but it is definitely powerful for black communities. Understand that the term you need to know here is the term militant. Militant is one of your vocabulary words, and that's a group of people that advocate more intensely, with more action, more assertiveness than other groups. And so militant groups like Black Power, Black Panther, and some could argue the Nation of Islam, become kind of an alternative to Martin Luther King and his more cooperational kind of group that, let's all work together and that kind of thing. So this tension between militancy and not militancy is something that's going to be very powerful for the black community, and this is still kind of with us today. March 1968. Know this: 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and he's assassinated outside of a hotel in Memphis, and this, causes a bunch of riots across the country. Really kind of creates a lot of anger and frustration. And they catch the guy who killed him. He serves jail time. And it's really kind of shattering. And again, we lose Martin Luther King before his stance on political issues is fully developed. So it's kind of like JFK. We have this snapshot of him that's very idealized because, we remember these key events, but he was killed before he could finish living his life. So we don't have that full picture of his own development and that kind of thing. So be sure March 1968 and Martin Luther King's assassination. And again, you will see that the Civil Rights Act of 1968 guarantees fair housing, because one of the problems that blacks were having, one of the issues that Martin Luther King was really talking about, was that that blacks couldn't get good housing, right, because they were discriminated against because they were black. And so the Civil Rights Act of 68 takes care of that. 1968 is seen as kind of the end of the black civil rights movement, and kind of the end of the civil rights era. Because what you have is after 1968, groups advocating for civil rights become very fractured. Like I said, even the black community is fractured among groups. And now you've got women, and you've got gays, and you've got Latinos, and you've got American Indians. And all of this makes it much, that there's not one singular civil rights movement. Now you've got all these different pieces to it. And of course, it's this that's going to have the impact on women and American Indians, and where they come in, where they start clamoring for their own rights and their own freedoms. So this is the end of the Civil Rights series. Takes us all the way up to the 1970s. Kind of touches a little bit, the previous one did, on issues of the 1970s and how these groups kind of manifest themselves. Be sure that that you look at the PowerPoint on civil rights leaders. You're going to need to know that. I'm not going to go over that because you can look at it and read it, and I'm planning on doing an activity in class. So you will need to take a look at that as well. Otherwise, I hope that you have been listening to all of these videos and paying attention, because it's very important that you have. Otherwise, the civil rights test is going to be very, very hard. All right, remember that you have a writing assignment coming up on, March the 1st. You will have a Unit 9 test coming up on March the 3rd, right before spring break. And then when we come back, you'll finish up your writing assignment for the quarter, and on the 17th, you will take your third quarter exam. All right.